Welcome to the first meeting of the Bucerius Institute's lecture series, Modernity's Others, Plurality and Counter-Hegemonic Perspectives in 20th Century German Language Literature. My name is Ariel Pridan, and I'm the Manfred Landstein Postdoctoral Fellow at the Bucerius Institute. I will be moderating the lectures in this series and doing my best to accommodate our fascinating speakers who have kindly agreed to take part in this project and share their expertise and scholarship. I would like to thank Professor Cedric Cohen-Scully, the director of the Bucerius Institute at Haifa University, for giving me the opportunity to organize this lecture series and for his ongoing support and encouragement. I would also like to thank Amir Baron, the administrative coordinator at Bucerius Institute, for his collaborative spirit and invaluable help in bringing this series to life. This lecture series is grounded in the idea that modernity, far from being a monolithic and unifying process, is inherently plural and dialectically differentiated. We will explore how 20th century German language literature grapples with marginalized, exclude, or counter-hegemonic aspects of modernity, challenging the mainstream narratives that define it. The lectures will highlight voices that these narratives often overlook or erase, helping us to rethink what it means to be modern and what it means to be excluded from that category. I'm honored and excited to present our first speaker, Professor Katie Trumpener. Professor Trumpener is the Emily Sanford Professor of Comparative Literature and English at Yale University, where she is also affiliated with Film and Media Studies, German and Jewish Studies. She has published monographs, co-edited volumes, and written articles on history of the novel, German literature and film, and art and visual culture, from picture books to panoramas. She has studied East German literature, film, and culture for over 40 years. She is currently completing 2 books, one on the Third Reich cinema and the Nazi occupation of Europe, and a sequel on East and West German film culture during the Cold War. Professor Trumpener's focus today is on how literature can contest state power and its monopoly over information, an essential issue when considering the diverse and often contentious nature of modernity itself. Her lecture, titled Against State Information, Monopoly, the Media Experiments of East German Dissident Writers, will explore the works of dissident writers in East Germany during the Cold War and their attempts to turn the tools of surveillance into platforms of resistance and critique, experimenting with the very media that the state sought to control. While our lecture series is concerned with the tensions between mainstream and marginalized versions of modernity, today's lecture focuses specifically on how these tensions played out in the highly controlled context of East Germany, offering a critical look at the relationship between state power, media, and literary devices. And we will see how German literature became a battleground for ideas of freedom, truth, and resistance. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Katie Trumpener.
I'm going to try to share my screen if I can. Let me just get my PowerPoint up. Yes, here we go. Okay, let me go back to sharing. Okay, hang on. Sorry, you're seeing my extremely messy. Let me just see. Let me just get my PowerPoint back up. There it is. Are you able to see it? Is that working, Ariel?
Yes.
Good, very good. Okay, so I'm going to just go into slideshow then. Okay. In Hans-Joachim Schädlich's 1977 story, Under the 18 Towers of Teen, 2 young East German tourists visiting Prague are brave or incautious enough to give an interview to a Western news crew in which they criticize the 1968 Soviet invasion. The tourists carefully stand with their back to the camera to avoid being identified. Back home, however, the Stasi, the State Secret Service, has recorded the television footage and asked linguists to listen to the voice track and identify which region of Germany the tourists are from. 2 linguists say they can't tell. A third correctly identifies the locale. Then the Stasi arranged follow-up interviews with those from that area who were recently in Prague and secretly tapes these interviews, enabling voice matchups and the arrest of the young dissidents. The story is partly autobiographical. Before emigrating to West Germany, Schädlich worked in the GDR as a dialectologist and was himself one of those who were summoned to and refused to identify dissident voices captured on tape. The episode raises deeply unpleasant ethical questions and professional dilemmas. Not least, voices recorded and collected under more auspicious circumstances, solely for scholarly study or out of patriotic pride, are now being deployed to help entrap and punish. Yet instead of cooperating with the Stasi and the state to categorize and pin down the literally captive voices of the dissident teenagers, Schädlich himself became a dissident writer and eventually emigrated to West Germany, where it then became possible to publish this disturbing story. This talk will focus particularly on the media questions this raises. Schädlich offers us a Stasi use of the tape recorder that seems Orwellian or Foucaultian. Yet in the 1960s and 70s GDR, the tape recorder was also being put to a range of other uses, some of them considerably less authoritarian. As I'd love to talk about in the Q&A, the GDR state itself from 1975 onward ran an interesting state-sponsored experiment in music pirating, hosting a weekly program called Duet, Music for the Tape Recorder, which invited East German listeners to tape whole sides of new Western record releases. Even more importantly, writers did their own experimenting. Now, just a minute here. Let me just see. There we go. Throughout the 1970s, a prominent GDR poet, Rainer Kunze, who we will be seeing quite a lot of in this talk, spent countless hours talking with and probably tape recording over 100 East German teenagers. Some of these conversations, probably based on snippets of recorded dialogue, formed the basis of a series of prose poems about the younger generation in the GDR and their increasingly fraught relationship with the authoritarianism of GDR schools, police, and cultural policy. The resulting book, The Wonderful Years, was published to great acclaim and led to Kunze's forcible expatriation from the GDR. In 1975, even more prominently, poet Sarah Kirsch published East Germany's pioneering feminist oral history, The Panther Woman, 5 unfrisierte Geschichten aus der Cassette Recorder. Although this was clearly inspired by similar West German women's oral history projects, it placed a lot more emphasis both on the ways tape recordings were able to inspire conversational, even confessional freeform telling, but also the reality of editorial decision-making beyond their printed forms. So by the 1970s then, the tape recorder was being used not only by the Stasi to collect incriminating evidence, but by poets interested in capturing overlooked life stories of GDR women and the simmering despair of GDR youth. And it was also being used by young people themselves to gather, archive, and trade countercultural music from the West. The East German government claimed for itself not only a monopoly on power, but a monopoly on information. That meant in practice that they controlled the press, radio, and television, all making approval and distribution of films, books, and records, and especially in the state's early decades, all access to typewriters and later photocopy machines. We tend to think of the GDR as a kind of slow-ticking tragedy in which intellectuals and authors struggle to internalize or at least to minimally comply with state dictates, only eventually under accumulating state pressures to be forced to immigrate. This was a place in which many major works of literature and film were unfinished or censored, never reaching their audiences, or only doing so after decades of delay when their greatest moment of topicality or relevance had been stolen from them, in which censorship frustrated many kinds of artistic dreams, and in which the Stasi, with their bugging devices and a suffocatingly dense network of informal agents and agents provocateurs, their misinformation and defamation campaigns greatly compromised the freedoms and lives of many artists and intellectuals. It's not that this view of the GDR is wrong. In fact, it was borne out in many respects by the flood of revisionist scholarship in the 1990s, which the fall of the wall and the opening of archives and Stasi files made possible. It suddenly became possible to get a much fuller overview, even than before, about the ways in which an always insecure state tried to control, monitor, and police its own citizens. For instance, there was a revelatory exhibit in 2002 at Berlin's Museum of Communications, which detailed the remarkable degree of Stasi oversight over post offices and mailboxes across the GDR. Many post offices had a special secret floor in which incoming and outgoing mail was steamed open, read, and copied before being resealed and delivered. Even individual mailboxes were often watched with surveillance teams and surveillance cameras. In the spirit of Schädlich's story, this enabled any compromising letter to be closely matched with senders and recipients. Yet if a popular film like The Lives of Others seemed to capture these sensational and deeply unpleasant aspects of GDR life, even filmed somewhat fetishistically using a series of original Stasi tape recorders, sweatometers, and other devices eagerly acquired by collectors after the fall of the wall, its vision of East Germany did not capture the whole truth about the lives of intellectuals and artists there. The GDR was singular among East Bloc states in the degree of enthusiasm for the socialist project among its artists and intellectuals. In Poland or Czechoslovakia, in contrast, intellectual and artistic life increasingly turned away from party ideas and saw itself simply as opposing them. But in the GDR, some critical artists like Wolf Biermann petitioned to join the party. Others spent years as party members, and even in a few singular cases, like those of Christa Wolf or Volker Braun, artists were considered seriously as candidates to join the Central Committee, even though their work was consistently quite critical. Many other prominent artists and intellectuals likewise remained deeply invested in the ideals of socialism, even if they increasingly saw it as their mandate to continue pointing out the glaring gaps between theory and practice. And even figures like Wolf Biermann and Thomas Brasch, who endured a decade of a kind of artistic house arrest, unable to perform or publish in the GDR, and who were both eventually in different ways forced into emigration in West Germany, continued once they were exiled to push against Cold War political absolutes. In 1976, as you may know, Wolf Biermann was finally permitted by the East German government to give a series of concerts in West Berlin. And his concert in Cologne was broadcast live and watched by a lot of East Germany too. A singular media experiment, except that at the end of the concert, he was refused re-entry into the GDR. He henceforth remained in exile despite the protests of many local intellectuals, writers, actors, and directors, many of whom endured such reprisals at the hands of the Stasi that they too eventually emigrated, part of a brain drain from which the GDR never recovered, and in retrospect, the beginning of the end. So I was lucky enough in 1979 to 80 as a foreign student in West Germany to hear Biermann twice in concert, where he mocked, these were very electrifying events, where he mocked both GDR excesses and West German conditions, pleading vehemently for a third way. And I'm just going to more briefly detail the parallel case of Thomas Brasch. In 1968, as a young film student, he and a group of friends and lovers protested the invasion of Czechoslovakia by leaving homemade protest leaflets in letterboxes and phone booths, probably imitating the actions of the White Rose during the Nazi period. Brasch's father was the GDR Ministry of Culture, and he turned his son into the Stasi. Bettina Wegner, who had just born Brasch's child, was expelled from drama school, spent a year in prison, and later became one of the most important dissident singer-songwriters in the GDR. The schoolboy Florian Havemann, of whom we will be talking later, who is the son of Robert Havemann, the GDR's most famous physicist and most famous dissident, was taken to juvenile detention and barred from university. He too emigrated. Thomas Brasch himself was expelled from film school, sentenced to prison and then to hard labor. And even though thereafter he was harbored for a while by the Berliner Ensemble, he remained unable to publish, stage his plays, or make films for the next decade. When he eventually emigrated to West Germany as part of the post-Biermann reprisals and Stasi persecutions, he was welcomed by the West German cultural establishment and immediately started publishing, producing plays to critical acclaim, and with the help of some of the new German film directors, began directing films. His first film was released more than a decade after his expulsion from the GDR film school, yet he described it only half ironically as the belated thesis project of his interrupted studies. When it was awarded the Bavarian Film Prize in 1981, the West German left criticized Brasch because he was willing to accept the award from Franz Josef Strauss, the conservative Bavarian premier. But the gala audience, on the other hand, booed Brasch's acceptance speech because he began by thanking the GDR Film School for my training, which must have been at least partly ironic since, of course, he had been expelled from film school, but it was simultaneously a public declaration of his GDR roots at a moment when West German conservatives were alternately trying to embrace GDR dissidents as fellow anti-communists or dismiss them as bad boy anarchists. I would suggest indeed that Biermann's Cologne concert, Brasch's televised acceptance speech, and 2 years earlier, Nina Hagen's simulated masturbation on Austrian television soon after she had emigrated, which got her banned from television throughout Western Europe, might all be understood as media experiments which tested the limits of Western media and Western free speech. So what exactly is a media experiment? I'm indebted here to a 1988 book by Dieter Wörle, which argue that some facets of Brecht's long career involved a series of what he calls media experiments. Not only did Brecht experiment pretty continuously with new media forms, including his 1927 photo book, The Manual of Piety, or his radio play, The Lindbergh Flight, the flight across the ocean, but even such live events as the Threepenny censorship trial were considered by him to be media experiments. What such texts and performances have in common, the book argues, are that they're meant to gauge the limits of specific media and test what uses publicity, radio, journalism, and the codex could be put to. And I found it very generative to try to apply this concept to the GDR and Cold War situations and to the work of GDR writers and émigrés. The GDR was a place of recurrent censorship and of frustrated artistic dreams that caused some artists to withdraw into alcoholism, mental illness, or silence. But quite a few others reacted with vehemence. Let me give just a small example. During the last decade of the GDR, the documentarian Thomas Heise had every single one of his works censored from film school onward, censored and banned. Since the fall of the wall, however, he became one of the most celebrated documentarians of the former East, and he was particularly important as a chronicle of neo-Nazi youth, an interest which went back to his student days in the GDR. When he first announced as a student that he planned to make a documentary about a family of lowlives and petty thieves, his film school teacher said sternly, "Why make a film about those people? Wozu denn über diese Leute einen Film?" So Heise's reaction was to title his film, "Why Make a Film About These People?" And the film predictably was banned, and it remained banned until '89. What I want to point to, though, is the force of Heise's response. Far from crumpling or feeling shame in response to his teacher's question, he instead used the question provocatively as his title. Like all of Heise's documentaries, the film portrait that results is empathetic and revelatory. By quoting the teacher's skeptical question as the film's title, he contrasts his own open, unjudgmental approach to documentary with the highly judgmental tone of the GDR studio system. Another media experiment. Brecht's media experiments assume that you have to shake the public sphere. You have to put new kinds of media together. You have to make the public think critically about what's happening. And if we view a lot of GDR works in this light, we can see, at least in retrospect, that the authors aren't cowed, but instead pushing back. They're not just inert martyrs, but almost continuously trying to forge something experimental out of the contradictions of their situation. Their form of political art runs alongside state-approved messaging, and it involves reflections on the public sphere and the media culture of the GDR. A lot of GDR texts, both those that are officially sanctioned and those that were critical, controversial, or banned, have a dialectical structure. The ideal clashes with reality, but this leads to a moment of synthesis, of hope, and a forward momentum. I would say that the body of more critical texts tend to be pushier than this, sometimes literally so. Here, for instance, is a rather beautiful 1981 short text by Volker Braun, part of his reports on Hinze and Kunze, one of his various topical adaptations of Diderot's Enlightenment novel, Jacques le Fataliste et son maître, to East German conditions. Do you see the larva studies 12? Do you see the butterfly? Before it rises in the wind, it is a caterpillar who can only crawl and eat, a chrysalis wrapped up so that it looks like a mere mummy, winged creature in the making. Thus, Lenin wrote that the political difference between socialism and communism would possibly be greater than that between capitalism and socialism. How true! But just as true and important, Kunze says, is our discomfort with this new space, dark and narrow as a cocoon, and our pressure, which will break through it. So as you can see, what Brown's parable emphasizes is discomfort and pressure as generative forces that can cause conceptual and political breakthroughs. Hence, what I've stressed so far is how GDR dissidents attempted to press back against inherently oppressive situations, creating works that offered critical exposés of these conditions. In the second half of the paper, I want to talk in a bit more detail about the intertwined experiments of Rainer Kunze and Wolf Biermann. In the 1960s and 70s, Rainer Kunze, one of the GDR's most prominent poets, published volumes of lyric poetry with evocative titles like With the Volume Turned Down, Zimmerlautstärke, and Letters with Blue Seals. Now, given what you've just heard about the post office, there is something interesting and provocative about talking both about listening to music with the volume turned down so that nobody complains, so that one's music is not overheard, and sealing the letter knowing that the post office is going to unseal it again. As we will see, his poems are often delicately lyrical, even as they address such taboo subjects as radio jamming, East German media pedagogy, and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. In 1968, in protest against the invasion, Kunze left the party and was thereafter spied upon by the Stasi under the ugly name as Target Lyric. That was his name for the Stasi. Perhaps even more resourcefully, Wolf Biermann, the singer-songwriter, writing under extended house arrest and continual Stasi surveillance, produced improvised radio collages, wrote a song, which I'll bring up in a moment, in which he hailed his Stasi observers as his amanuenses and his biographers. Die Stasi ist mein Eckermann, and repeatedly used his own Stasi-bugged Berlin apartment as an improvised recording studio whose ambient street noises became part of the particular illicit frisson of his records. I want to start with a little bit of media history to give context and contours to these experiments. Until the building of the wall in 1961, Berlin was an open city where media was often available to people on both sides. Every night for many years, until 1961, for instance, tens of thousands of East Berliners crossed over to the other side of the city to go to the movies. Many of them frequented West Berlin's 24 government-subsidized border cinemas, Grenzkino, which were located strategically near major sector borders. They operated as third-run nonstop houses, and they catered solely to GDR citizens whose identity cards entitled them to tickets at nominal prices payable in Eastern or Western currency. So for many East Germans, this remained the only affordable form of Western moviegoers. Those who frequented border cinemas did so knowing they might be spotted there and maybe even reported on by acquaintances or work colleagues. Although expatriate audiences disliked the need for furtiveness, the border cinemas were consistently full, and it's possible that their aura of political risk and complicity may even have enhanced their allure. Originally, they were intended to showcase the superiority of capitalism, the Christian West, and the West German way of life. Instead, they became dumping grounds for American Westerns, gangster films, pornographic films, and West German flops. Such programming drew both East and Western criticism, while East German party officials warned adolescents against playing hooky in West Berlin cinemas lest they find themselves recruited into Western gangs or espionage rings. West German officials lamented the audience of do-nothings that such films drew, undesirable for political and moral reasons. Meanwhile, many communist intellectuals who decried border cinemas nonetheless frequented them regularly. For some, their passionate attachment to Western genre films seems only to have fueled equally passionate public denunciations of these films. As East German viewers were continually and explicitly reminded, the Cold War itself was being conducted in part through the media. The GDR's own strongly expressed, indeed unilateral positions were to be understood in relationship and counterpart to Western representations. Far from concealing its own revisionist efforts, GDR media repeatedly tried to make them visible. A 1948 newsreel, for instance, framed its photographic presentation of Western warmongering with a montage commentary sequence of Western headlines being rapidly blue-penciled and dissected by a critical Eastern editorial hand. Edvard von Schnitzler's Media Watch television show, Der Schwarze Kanal, the Black Channel, trained GDR viewers every week in defensive media analysis in the left modernist tradition of Hans Richter or John Hartfield. Although this program was deeply unpopular with GDR viewers, it ran for almost 30 years. And in fact, during the 1989 mass protests that led to the fall of the GDR, one public demand of citizens was the cancellation of this program because they hated it as a hypocritical mouthpiece of official rhetoric. Now, let me just briefly tell you about an interesting media experiment. In 1964, the recent GDR emigre writer Uwe Jonsson, the great late modernist novelist, who is one of the great chroniclers of East Germany and of East-West tensions, participated in a telling East-West media experiment. The GDR newspapers never printed listings for Western radio or television programs, and in turn, in 1960, the Western press ceased to print listings for Eastern programs to try to get viewers into boycotting GDR media. Jonsson was opposed to boycotts. Given the forced cessation of Berlin's former border traffic, he argued, it was all the more crucial that the two Germanys use media to continue observing and monitoring each other. Hence, the first West Berlin newspaper to break the boycott and start printing GDR media schedules again hired Jonsson to serve for a few months as its critic of GDR television. His reviews repeatedly focused attention on the GDR's incongruous and hypocritical Monday night lineups. First of all, a program called For the Film Fan, which showcased Third Reich genre cinema, was then followed every week by the Black Channel, which dissected and denounced recent Western television coverage. As Jonsson underscored, GDR television regularly revisited and reactivated Nazi-era cinema, the familiar kitsch of the old UFA, to lure viewers into staying tuned for the Black Channel. The first program was very popular with viewers, but there's no evidence they actually stayed tuned. Television and radio remained the main media conduits between the Germanies, yet both for technological and ideological reasons, their reception became increasingly asymmetrical. The GDR started jamming Western broadcasts in 1952, continued jamming for almost 20 years, and then resumed again in 1988 to block reception of Glasnost radio programs. Yet they remained unable to check East Germans' assiduous consumption of West German programming. After the building of the wall, indeed, the Central Committee discussed erecting an additional electronic wall, which would jam all television signals coming from the West. Instead, there was a series of national initiatives attempting to modify viewing habits. In one particularly famous or infamous campaign, Operation Strike Against NATO Stations, conducted during the turbulent weeks after the wall had gone up, 25,000 uniformed members of the state youth organization climbed onto rooftops all over East Germany to turn all antenna eastward. Yet, in some cases, they physically removed, threw down from the roofs, and trampled on the antennas. But this was seen as too much zeal, and these antennas were later reinstalled at state expense. GDR public television sets installed in public viewing rooms, workplaces, or clubs had locks on their channel selectors to ensure they remained tuned to GDR stations. GDR school children and anybody buying a television set had to sign a pledge that they would not watch Western television, and some apparently felt deeply guilty when they watched anyway. Yet, although it remained unwise to talk publicly about things said or heard on Western television or radio, everybody knew that everyone else was watching too. For years, this was an open secret, which was tacitly condoned if still not approved by the state. When GDR citizens visited Western border cinemas or tuned illicitly into Western radio or television stations, they arguably entered an interior extraterrestrial world, extraterritorial world, not defined or circumscribed by Cold War borders or polarities. Rainer Kunze's 1965 dissident poem, The Aerial, champions this illicit, unbounded viewing as an attempt to preserve not only subjectivity and inwardness, but cosmopolitanism and open-mindedness. The street threatened to saw it down. The aerial fled to the rooftop. Here, the house pointed its finger at it. The aerial fled into the room. Here, the walls pointed their fingers at it. The aerial fled into the head. It offered safety for the moment. Manifestations of state coercion, like the 1961 antenna turning campaign, can control neither media access nor what continues to play in GDR heads. Indeed, even as they anxiously anticipated further political pressure and curtailment, Kunze suggests, East German heads still continued to harbor and safeguard aerials, pointed in multiple directions and capable of tuning into many different stations, an implicit refusal of the state's insistence on its right to media monopoly. I want to then now move to a poem which chronicles what happened in the summer of 1968 when GDR troops were put on high alert and stood by to support the Red Army in its invasion of Czechoslovakia. GDR military leaders misled them as to the purpose and targets of their military action. Kunze has a prose poem, which at greater length than I'm showing here, chronicled one soldier's experience, probably reproducing verbatim the soldier's account of it, and detailing the hypocrisy, cynicism, opportunism, and incoherence of GDR media politics. As they awaited deployment, the soldiers heard rumors that the Soviets were invading defensively to forestall the disastrous consequences of an East-West co-production. In this legendary version of unfolding events, a Czech film company had attempted to make a film during NATO maneuvers with the cooperation of the West German Army, which then seized the occasion to invade Czechoslovakia. As with the building of the Berlin Wall 7 years before, the Soviet invasion was to be justified as a reaction to a media-occasioned incursion. because the justification, the wall itself was called the defensive protection wall, and it was specifically supposed to be guarding East German citizens against things like West German billboards. Meanwhile, the artillery unit remained deliberately cut off from Western sources of information. The radio was blocked, the dial was taped over so it only received GDR stations, and in lieu of drilling, the unit began long political media analysis sessions, focusing on an ideological critique of Western rock music, especially the Beatles and the Doors' Light My Fire. The unit was also shown many films, yet gradually the usual screening of normal films, i.e. East German and Soviet films, nothing political entertainment, gave way to Western films intended to elevate morale, swashbuckling French-Italian co-productions, an anti-American West German film, and finally, porn films, a genre otherwise unknown to the GDR general public. Having learned from the 1953 workers' uprising, in which West Berlin American radio had helped fan and spread popular revolt, GDR leadership remained determined to shield soldiers from Western political analysis and from competing accounts of current developments. Yet the party's fundamental distrust of foreign media, as the poem shows, did not forestall a cynical redeployment of Western films to produce in its soldier viewers precisely the negative effects it had long officially condemned, namely pornographic excitement and sexually laden military aggression. In the GDR itself, the invasion was experienced as a traumatic event, exciting widespread chagrin, contempt, and depression, at least among intellectuals. As I've mentioned before, over 100 GDR students, many the children of prominent parents, protested the invasion and found themselves in detention. And I've talked a little bit about, I've mentioned before Florian Havemann, for instance, a trial in the lengthy Stasi interrogation in a high security prison led some of the leafleters to be publicly tried in October of '68 on the grounds of subversive incitement. State prosecutors emphasized the influence of enemy propaganda centers, radio and television stations in shaping their criminal acts. Florian Havemann was sent to juvenile detention, but found that sufficiently traumatic that he fled to West Germany soon after his release. Wolf Biermann was a family friend, and in his 1973 protest song, he mourned Havemann's departure as a political desertion, emblematic for a lost generation of GDR dissidents. The song was called Enfant Perdu, taking its title from a poem by Heine from the 19th century, which was also about a losing battle in the war for freedom and long years of exile. Accompanying this lament for Havemann's paradigmatic departure from East to West was a sound collage that sampled and counterpointed material from East and West Berlin radio. And in a few minutes, I want to play you a tiny bit of that. In 1968, several years after a strict ban had forbidden Biermann from all public performances and recording, Biermann nonetheless began illegally recording his songs in his East Berlin apartment with a small tape recorder. The title of his first solo record, Chausseestraße 131, defiantly announces the address of this makeshift recording studio, as if to reverse the surreptitious conditions of the recording itself. Chausseestraße Boulevard Street in the center of East Berlin was itself a storied address, since Brecht himself had lived there too, on Chausseestraße 125, a mere 6 houses away. The most famous song on this record is the so-called Barlach song. I'm just pointing out that Biermann takes his style, as you'll hear, and his album cover style, not only from Bob Dylan, but also from the Russian guitar poets after 1956, who wrote a lot of songs about the Gulag, about the thaw, and so on. So the most famous song on this first record was the Barlach song, which in a moment I'll play the beginning of. The song was written probably originally for an experimental East German biopic about the Nazi persecution of Ernst Barlach, an expressionist sculptor who was hounded by the Nazis, and the film itself centered on the 1937 theft of his sculpture Floating Angel from Güstrow Cathedral. Then Biermann began experiencing his own state persecution, and the movie was banned. When it was released 5 years later, it was re-edited and without the song. I want to just play you a little bit of the song, especially so you can hear not only Biermann's guitar style, but also, just a minute here, sorry, here are the lyrics. Now, how will I reach, I'm going to run into a trouble here. Just a minute. I want to show you it, but I also need to get back to just a minute. Okay. If I stop sharing, you won't be able to read the lyrics. I'm very sorry about this. Okay. I'm going to have to stop the share. I'm very sorry. Because I want to be able to play you the lyrics so you can hear them. You can hear the sound of it. Okay.
Mutter, mach die Fenster zu. Ich glaube, es kommt ein Regen. Drüben steht die Wolkenwand, die will sich auf uns legen.
Clouds are coming down on us.
Was aus uns noch werden?
What will become of us?
Uns droht so große Not.
It's terrible. From heaven, the angels are falling down dead. Okay, and here's the very end of the recording where again you can hear, I'm sorry about that, this is terrible. Sorry. Awful. Okay. There we go. Okay, we're not going to be able to hear the end of the song. I'm sorry about that. Okay. What was particularly moving for listeners of this record, as Rainer Kunze records in his poem Wolf Biermann Sings, and I'll get that back up in a minute, was the way Biermann's critical laments were punctuated by the audible squealing of passing Chausseestrasse streetcars. In the room, the streetcar squeaks. It squeaks from Biermann's record, recording the chansons without a studio. He sings of Ernst Barlach's great agony, which grips us all, since we all know about the ban and hear the streetcar. I'll just read it quickly in German. Im Zimmer kreischt die Straßenbahn, sie kreischt von Biermanns Platte, der, als die Chansons aufnahm, kein Studio hatte. Singt von Barlachs großer Not, sie fasst uns alle an, denn jeder kennt doch die Verbot und hört die Straßenbahn. The sound at once of defiance in everyday life, these background noises rendered audible the government prohibition against Biermann, even as the unintended sound collage represented a non-official mode of realism, as if everyday life itself had mobilized against the ban and against official aesthetics. On his next album, Biermann set Enfant Perdu to a more deliberate oral collage, traversing the radio dial and alert to political ironies on and between the frequencies. Opening the collage, and especially prominent within it, is the extended celebratory GDR live radio coverage of military parades marking the visit of a Czech government delegation and the post-invasion renormalization of GDR-Czech relations. But the collage also includes Vietnam War broadcasts, British Armed Forces disc jockey patty, and broadcasts of Christian and Jewish sacred music. I just want to play you a few instances of this so you can hear a bit of the collage.
kleine Flori habe, 2 Meter Mann, das Brave, das uralt Kluge.
Die Formation der Nationalen Volksarmee ist beendet. Nun geht es ans Abnehmen.
Als ersten Frankfurt ist zufrieden und ließen die vollen Airport.
Herzlicher, aufgeschlossener Atmosphäre geht dieser Besuch zu Ende. Gustav Fosak und Lubomir Strugal, Partei- und Regierungsdelegation der Tschechoslowakischen Sozialistischen Republik in der Deutschen Demokratischen Republik. Ein Besuch, der die Chronik der Beziehungen unserer
Saturday type morning. Like, would you believe 1957?
Okay, so that's the end of the song. Sorry, let me get back to sharing. I'm sorry that was audio-visually sort of a mess, but anyway, maybe you got the idea. Okay, so I'm sorry you missed all the lyrics, but it's a song well worth checking out. Radio stations fade in and out, but even their blurriness and overlap is complex and fascinating. Above all, Biermann's sampling counters the one-sidedness of GDR media pedagogy. The party's power rests partly on its information monopoly and its willingness in a crisis to jam the radio signals. Under normal circumstances, however, it cannot actually prevent its citizens from hearing, seeing, and comparing media for themselves. Those with a radio can dial themselves outside the bounds of the GDR, gaining perspective and context, and those with a tape recorder can make their own records, whether the state sanctions it or not. So just to conclude briefly, to many, I'm sure, the entire corpus of GDR literature has seemed since 1989 like a dead letter, since the state itself was so clearly, in retrospect, a failed experiment. Perhaps I was lucky that I happened to be studying in West Germany, including several weeks in the GDR when I did. It was a turbulent moment when a lot of GDR critical writers were arriving in Germany as emigres, melancholy but still deeply defiant. I still, all these decades later, find their work from the 60s, 70s, and 80s thought-provoking and imaginative, well worth reading, rereading, and teaching. And for me, at least, their civil courage, their force, and their imagination have remained highly memorable, helping me over the intervening decades to make me braver and more uncompromising about some of my own political and academic principles. In our own age of Alexei Navalny and Hong Kong's new security laws, to say nothing of recent authoritarian attempts, including in the United States, to control press access, free speech within universities and universities themselves, it is worth reconsidering this earlier generation of principled dissidents, for they not only protested a closed government-controlled media circuit, but they tried again and again to bend it to creative and critical ends. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Trumpener, for that interesting talk and for sharing your insights with us. So if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom window and I will call you in order. You can also type your question in the chat and I'll read it out loud. for Professor Trumpener to address.
And if anybody would like to turn their screen on, I would be interested to see who's here. No pressure, but just saying. Olatal, hi.
I actually have a question. It's okay. I don't know if I can just like barge in. That's legal.
Of course.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, Katie. This was very illuminating for me. I obviously know very little, actually nothing about all that. But I'm curious because I mean, you talked about media and well, mainly about media and how that changed in the GDR, but you didn't talk about circulation and target audiences. So I was left curious about that. So when you talk about all these recordings, who were they meant to, and how did they reach the people they were meant to reach?
So, so one odd thing about the GDR geographically is that actually the Western signals, which were more powerful, could reach listeners in East Berlin and in many parts of East Germany better than the GDR's own signals could reach them. So of course this was a source of anguish for the ideologues in the government, but this was just sort of a fact on the ground. The only region of East Germany which could not receive West German television was the area around Dresden in Saxony. For atmospheric reasons, they weren't able to receive it, and so they were always known as, in GDR slang, as the Valley of the Clueless, because they had to rely completely on East Bloc broadcasting, and they didn't have a kind of alternate source. So in West Germany, I didn't go into this. I realize I gave you far more information about the media landscape than you probably cared to hear. To me, it's very interesting, all the details of kind of how this was worked out. So I think one of the issues was West German television and radio absolutely thought of the GDR as a target audience. And for that reason, this is one of those illuminating retrospective moments. In my childhood, my brother is on this call too. He and I were children watching television to try to learn German in West Germany in 1970. And they always endlessly would have coming programs on television. And it would kind of scroll down at 8 o'clock, it's going to be this. And at 9 o'clock, it's going to be that. The reason they did that, it turns out, is partly because they were trying to reach East German viewers who didn't have any printed sources to tell them what was on. So they were absolutely, not only was there particular programming about East Germany aimed at East Germany, but all of the television really thought of them as a kind of extra audience. I think the East Germans were pretty clear that almost nobody increasingly was listening to them. And that's an interesting other phenomenon of the Cold War, which I myself experienced somewhat when I lived again in West Berlin in the late 80s. To stay sane there, you kind of had to block out that there was a parallel society next to you, because also it was very militarized. The whole situation was kind of frightening. There were soldiers and tanks in the city. So you just, even though I went over there quite often, and I often did listen to East German radio, and I made my own little radio collages, there was a way in which most West Berliners didn't. They just decided it wasn't really there. So they had a kind of wall in the head syndrome, which is interesting. But you're asking really about, so Wolf Biermann was able to, he actually made his records with Columbia Records, and then it would be played on West German radio, and then it would reach East Germany, and everybody could tape it. So it did circulate in a kind of samizdat kind of way. Let me just talk for a minute, since this is my opening, to talk about the fascinating radio pirating. So basically there was this program which was called Duet for the tape recorder. And the head of the station would cross over as a civilian to West Berlin every week. He would go to a record store. He would buy whatever the big things were. Then they would play the entire record on the East German station, hoping everybody at home could tape it so that they could tape it. And of course, this was in complete violation of copyright. They paid no royalties. So, they were ripping off the Western record companies. But apparently they thought of this as a kind of, poke in the side of the enemy. The weird effect, of course, was that they armed East German youth with a lot more Western music than they would have had already. So, and this was a government which had actually precipitated youth riots when they tried in the 60s to ban East German rock bands that they didn't like, or they tried that, they would also, officials would go to dances and try to stop people from dancing in rock and roll dance styles. And anyway, this was kind of a lost cause, as you can imagine. And then on the other hand, there's this youth radio station with official sanction, which is kind of opening Columbia Records and everybody else to be taped. So the tape recorder, my point was in a way a simple one. The tape recorder is used in lots of different ways. I guess that's the way of media. It can move in a lot of directions that are unintended. I did have a early student at Yale who wrote really interestingly about in Czechoslovakia, videotape was being used in the 80s. People would smuggle cameras in, and then they would make like news programming, which they would then reproduce illegally and smuggle out to the West where it would be aimed back in. So that was a more elaborate thing. Part of me thinks that one of the reasons the GDR and the East Bloc fell apart was that the control over the media started to kind of break down in the 80s, partly with new generations of technology, and that in a way, all of the planned economies were too rigid and undercapitalized to be able to be flexible enough to build kind of high-tech economies, so they couldn't really keep up. And, so anyway, there was the effect of kind of the tight grip on information, increasingly eluding them. And one thing that's to me very fascinating is it's simply a fact that a lot of the dissident groups ended up being housed in and around the Protestant churches, which were barely tolerated, but they did by the government, but they did have their own Xerox machines. And that was really crucial. So it meant that the first ecological newsletter could be published and mimeographed on the machine and so on. So this question of who has access to, media with a reproductive potential turns out to be really important for the kind of end phase of things. So I don't know if that answers your question at all. One really interesting thing to me is, the GDR officials were always highly, highly aware that everybody preferred Western films and that nobody wanted to watch their films. Their films are actually, many of them, very interesting, very carefully made, very beautifully made, and, not without their own complexity. But in a way, it's interesting that they hardly ever did things like audience surveys because they didn't really want to know about the true unpopularity of their own productions. They would usually count tickets given out, but they would give out tickets in factories and in businesses, and they didn't actually know who attended. You can throw a bunch of tickets from an airplane. It doesn't mean that people are going to go to the show. So anyway, since you ask about audiences, let's not ask that question. I think was basically their attitude.
Thank you. Do we have more questions? I myself have a couple of them, but I want to be polite.
I call on you.
Something I remember from my childhood in West Germany was the Sandmann series, a children's stop motion evening program. But I think kind of interesting because I understand there was an East German version as well as a West German version. And I think maybe it's the one East German product I understand that was well liked. The East German version was maybe even better than the West German one. I don't know who was the original and who was the copy, but just I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
I think it's probably the East German studio, and it's puppets. It's stop action puppets who are being used in the East German one, marionettes and stop action figures. They're actually often quite beautiful. They're kind of works of art for children. The one we saw was the animated one, which was good, but not as good in my view. So anyway, and both of them, it's one of the few, as you probably know, the terms on which East Germany was sort of collapsed and became part of West Germany was unoptimal from some people's point of view. And I do share that opinion in some ways. Like the whole media landscape was just raised completely. Most of the directors, even the most critical ones, never worked again because everything became westernized. So for instance, the youth radio station, which was, the conduit for the Beatles and the people that had the, pirated onto your tape cassette, they were, of course, closed along with every other radio station. So, all the Western stations took over. So there was a real eradication of the media landscape that was there. Insofar as the media landscape was pretty problematic, okay, you can see why that happened, but they erased the good with the bad pretty indiscriminately. So, but Zonmenschen is one of the things that remains, and they do still show up. It's also really interesting that in 1989, people in the East made clear, many people, I never ever want to watch an East German film again. It gives me the shivers when I watch that programming. But that attitude changed radically. So now there's a whole regional channel for Middle Germany that plays East German cultural material, television material from morning to midnight every day. And for those of us interested in the GDR, it's the greatest source of information and programming and old films and so on and so on. So basically, you now have people living partly in an old media landscape. And when you think about how much changed around people, many, many people lost their jobs and were never employed again, especially the older people. The cityscapes were changed beyond recognition. The pace of life changed. Like all kinds of aspects of culture just vanished. And so even though before 89, people scoffed at GDR television and found it unrealistic, didn't like it, etc., it nonetheless captures something of the old pace of things and has enormous comforting value as we didn't just dream out, we really were there. That was our real life for decades, etc. So I just find that fascinating, actually.
Okay. Do we have more questions? Well, I would like to ask a couple of questions. Well, I had one is actually, I think it continues what Lital asked about when you read Biermann's poem, as well as Kunze. I sense that they both have this appeal to cosmopolitanism or shared humanity. And I was wondering if this is also the case of trying to, again, address a broader audience. This is one question, and another question is, we talked about the way those dissident artists pushed back in many ways, and I was wondering if this pushing back was also manifested in their very use of language as a means to represent. And the last question I have, very interesting, you pointed to the fact that the structure of their poems, of their works was dialectical. But again, you said something about the problematics of this dialectical structure. So I was wondering if you can think of it in Adorno's terms as negative dialectics, like something that refuses to reach full synthesis, as something that also maybe manifests these writers' historical consciousness. So if you can say a few minutes about it.
Yeah, and so in a way, I mean, I do deeply love that larva poem where it's the pressure. The pressure is what's going to move us forward. And in a way, if you think about the classic dialectic, that's to get stuck on the antithesis part. That's to push there and not reach this sort of happy moment where, despite the mess we leave behind us, we're emerging into the sky. It is about that, but the emphasis is actually on the agony and the pain and the pressure that's necessary to kind of pop the lid off, not the glory that awaits beyond, which I find really, really interesting. So I think, I mean, one reason I find Kunze interesting, I first read The Wonderful Years when it came out, and I don't think it's his best work. It was hugely successful. They made a film of it, a not very good film, and it was seen as a kind of great barometer in the West of what's happening in East Germany. Oh my God, it's so miserable. People are anxious. And it's an important piece for doing that, but he kind of has to abandon his lyrical voice to do that. And most of it is, it's prose poems, and most of it is kind of based on utterances and pretty close to ordinary language. And whereas I think in his earlier works, his first book was called Sensitive Paths, and the emphasis was really on a kind of sensitivity to things, which this system doesn't particularly make room for and doesn't particularly value. It is a productivist society which emphasizes the kind of hurly-burly. And I think he has that in common, for instance, with Bettina Wegner, who I just mentioned in passing, but she was one of the people arrested for the leafleting campaign, and she goes on to become kind of the conscience of East Germany. She emigrates relatively late, so she's still there to lament and grieve publicly. After they've all gone, she even has kind of desperate songs about everybody is leaving and how terrible that feels. But she has a lot of songs, for instance, where she thinks about children, because she herself had several children, and the sensitivity of children and the delicacy of children's ears, their fingers, and yet they're facing a state which is kind of brutalizing in a lot of ways. And so I would say that emphasis on the sensitivity and the kind of barometer that keeps being tuned to the ethical dilemmas, that's a really important thread that's a kind of lyrical thread that runs through this. And in their moment in the early 60s, there was this, Kirsch was part of this, Kirsch and Kunze were part of this new movement, these new lyricists, these second generation lyricists who emerged. And everybody was very excited by them, but they were kind of unnerved by them too, because they were more aesthetically oriented than the people who had been there before. And, this is a society that tried to take up the Soviet Union's socialist realist mandates in the 50s and had an anti-formalist campaign of sorts, and, kind of disowned a la Lukács, the kind of German leftist modernist tradition. I mean, Brecht was not only tolerated, but got his own theater, but he was always pretty embattled, and a bunch of his productions were also banned. And anyway, it was a tough place, really a tough place. But I think it's interesting that Kunze's recommendation throughout is fight through your sensitivity. And of course, what was most disturbing to him in interviewing young people is they felt the sensitivity of the aesthetic pleasure, the political fight was being bullied out of them. That was, that was a kind of, for him, a political crisis. And he wasn't the only writer to say that, but he was one of the most memorable writers. So, the volume is called The Wonderful Years, and it's the German translation of the Truman Capote, these were the wonderful years. Well, how wonderful are they under these circumstances? So this is such a grim topic, but I nonetheless find I'm energized by these writers who I think of as just really determined. Sorry, Ariel, I probably have missed or forgotten one of the questions.
No, that was actually, I think you answered all of them, and I think what resonates, I'm so sorry, we have Professor Michal Ben-Chorin here. Yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. I was thinking while speaking about, Ariel mentioned Adorno and the negative dialectics, and you walked about this media and the radio and the recordings, and I was wondering about the sound as such.
Yeah.
What role does it play in your project, both in the sense of the, the critical, kind of critical mode, in the lyric and the song itself, but also in the radio, like in the technical.
Yeah. Well, what I'm working on at the moment is I'm trying desperately to finish these 2 film books, and in both cases, I try to think about media as a kind of larger surround. So I have a chapter in the Cold War book, which is called Mediascapes of the Cold War, where I try to think about this. And I also try to think about later weirdnesses, like the Wall newspaper was embraced by the Westerman student movement as this great Maoist invention, brand new to them. And at the same time, people in East Germany, like in East Berlin, like 3 miles away, were being arrested for posting the wrong thing on the Wall newspaper. So it's just interesting. There are these media forms that are living in a different rhythm in the different places. So basically, when I started many years ago to work on this Cold War project, I reread and reread and reread all of East German literature, trying to find what's their take on this. They are obsessed with media, it turns out, for all kinds of reasons. The state had tried hard to get writers integrated into all forms of media making, and they had especially tried to, induce the best writers to write for the film studio, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, there's that professional interest, but they also, I think, rightly see it as a kind of barometer of what's most dystopic about the society. So they write about it obsessively. So I have an article, which I was trying to kind of get it out of the film book. Okay, this is becoming about literature again, and this is supposed to be in my project that's finally really about film. So I have an essay which talks about what happens when people go into kind of film reveries and they bring up film memories, and there's kind of a collapse of historical time and so on and so on. So I haven't thought so much about sound per se, but on the other hand, there it is. And even to realize I knew these Biermann records pretty well, but it didn't occur to me until, I don't know, 10 years ago. Actually, we're dealing with sound collaging here. This is really interesting what's happening. This is an experimental soundscape that he's making. And of course, it's pretty amateurish as sound art goes. But it's part of a series of multidisciplinary experiments going on all over Eastern and Western Europe. And, you could think about it in relationship to music, to experimental music and so on, right? It's very interesting, actually. And I guess I'm just also really struck, I know this isn't really what you're asking, but at this actually quite close relationship between Kunze and Biermann, that they're actually responding so directly to each other's works and thinking about each other's works. And, that's pretty interesting too. But I know, in a way, the challenge would be to think about cadence and to think about the musicality of especially the new lyricism that emerges in the 60s, to think about that. And I guess insofar as I do sometimes get to teach East German literature, one of the ironies is I wrote my dissertation about the 18th and 19th century, and yet I got a very good first job as the East Germanist, because I had this long avocational interest in it. But then the wall fell before I could start teaching. So people said in my presence, do we even need an East Germanist? And in a way, I guess the answer was no. Why did we hire her for? But, I became a person who taught East German literature quite often because that's what they had hired me to do. And I'm actually teaching it this semester again, and it's very interesting. I have 20 students who are really very, very interested in this. And I think for a range of reasons. A couple of the students are either from China or are Chinese. And I think for them, there's very interesting parallels between family stories and what they themselves have experienced and so on and so on. And then some of the students are, I think, interested in socialism. And I actually, interestingly, have 2 composers in my class who are doing master's degrees in composition. So they often can give a very subtle reading of, how it's a literature and film course. So, what's happening on the soundtrack, how the soundtrack is happening. So I should urge them to, think about writing a paper about the Biermann sound collages. I just find it interesting that, Kunze alerts us to the fact that the studio noises on the first record are very, very important because, on the one hand, it's a sound of authenticity. And I think, who was it? Michelle Schacht had a record called the Campfire Album or the Campfire Tapes, in which she sat at a campfire in the forest and taped herself singing to the guitar. And that sounds really, really different from a studio album. You know, you can hear the fire, you can hear the crickets, you can hear the woods, you just have all these ambient noises there. So it's very much a non-sterile sound. So there's that. But it's also interesting that he then like took a cue from his own sound mix and started deliberately sound mixing. And also, given his circumstances, he's in this heavily bugged apartment, right, where there's just a bug everywhere. So everything he does, as he says in the Stasi song, you know, when I'm on the toilet, when I'm having sex, they're hearing me. So I just have to live my life as if they're not there, and just or like do it for their benefit. You know, I'm forced into this 24/7 kind of performative life. So and that he doesn't even close the windows, that he opens the windows. Okay, I want to be, you know, I'm in this Stasi-bugged apartment. I want to be recording in a free space. Well, the free space is going to have to include ambient noise, bird song, trolley car. Okay, so it does. Anyway, I mean, there's a lot to think about, I think.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm afraid that this is all the time we have for today. So thank you again, Professor Trumpener.